Okay, so we are back working with our database, our ADONet demo, and the thing that we're working on is taking this string for the connection string and putting it into our config file. So we added this connection strings. We use the add statement in here to add a name, which is going to be the key value for this connection string, and then the actual connection string down here, and then the provider name, which is the name of the class that we're going to use to work with our database. In this case, since it's a SQL Server database, we're going to use SQL Client. And then here, rather than putting the full path to school MDF, which is in our project, we're going to use this shortcut, which is data directory, which basically is the path to our project, and then we are pointing to our school db.mdf here. So once we have this, now we need to add a reference to the system configuration namespace or framework. And I always forget whether it's in framework or it's in extensions. I think it's in framework. You can use this, by the way, if you have multiple projects, like a library project in your solution.
Are you configurations?
What's that?
Configurations, is that what you're looking for?
Yes, system configuration. It should be down
so
here.
it's system.extensions.configuration. Oh no, that one's a different one.
Yeah, no, that might be .NET Core.
Core is pain in the ass.
So for this one, it's system configuration, but Gary brings up a good point, is that sometimes these namespaces change depending on updates to the frameworks. But for .NET Framework, which we're working in, it should be system configuration. By the way, you can also, if you have other projects in your solution, you can add references from one project to the next in here. But we're going to be working with just system.configuration. Notice there's also a whole bunch of other frameworks in here. I can see Oracle Client, for example, if you're going to be working with an Oracle database, and there's a bunch of stuff in here. So this is a really extensive framework. So once I have system.configuration selected, I'm going to click OK, and I should see it show up over here. And there we have system.configuration right there. The purpose of system.configuration is basically to give you access to your app config folder. And a lot of these configuration tags are standardized, but you can actually make your own configuration settings for your application if you wanted to. And there are tutorials on that as well. But it'll be very similar to what we're about to do. So I'm going to go back to school.cs, and now I don't want to use this directly. I just want to get it from my configuration file. So I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to add a using directive for using system.configuration. And the system.configuration gives us access to a static class called a configuration manager. And when I hit configuration manager, if I look in here, I see app settings and connection strings. If I look at the app config, there's startup and there's connection strings. And so if I hit the dot again, let's see. And so I want connection strings. So I'm going to click on connection strings. And then this is a dictionary, which means that we put a square brace, but instead of, and you can put an index, so you could go 1, 2, 3, but you can also put a a string, and it's probably better to use a string. And what we're going to use is this name we provided up here. So that name will go in here. That will get us access to the connection string. Basically, this whole information, it's a group of information with name, provider name, and connection string. And if I put a dot now, I can see I get name, provider name, and connection string. So I'm going to grab that connection string. So it's kind of weird. We have connection strings and then the connection string, but you could also get. So this is just a big complicated way of getting access to a dictionary, which gives us access to our connection strings. Does that make sense? So the cool thing is now our connection string is in one place, and wherever we need to get it, we will use the configuration manager to get it. So let's see if this works. I'm going to hit Control F5. If it works, I should be getting my data into my my page. And we can see we are still getting all of our data, so it works. Yes. Now, let me ask you this. You all know how to work with files. This is just a file. Could you have made a file using the same techniques you knew in C++1 and use that to store your configuration data, and then just made a little helper program that opened it up and coughed up the data from that program as an array or as a dictionary or as whatever you wanted? Yeah, the correct answer to that is absolutely. That would be easy as cake. So yeah, you know, you can. There's a lot of ways of making configuration files, and you know, just a plain. And you know, at one point they probably tended to be just plain text files that had the data maybe stored, maybe comma separated, maybe just a list of settings. And that's where you would put your program. That's where you would put your configuration settings, and of course, each one would be different for each program. What basically a framework like .NET does is it says, hey, you know, there's 500 different ways of building a configuration or config file. Why don't we just do it as some nice standard like either XML or JSON? This is still a text file. This is still read. You know, there's XML parsers and JSON parsers which are built into what Microsoft used to read these. But essentially, it's just a text file, and you have a class which gives you access to the information in that text file. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So a lot of these things seem complex when you first encounter them in .NET, but fundamentally, they do have, you know, their intricacies, but if you understand fundamentally what they are, it's not quite as mysterious as that. So we've got our connection string. We create our connection. You know, all this is working the same way. And we learned how to use a SQL data reader. And so let's do one more thing with this. We're going to maybe make a, let's see, I think in this project, we have some drop downs. In major. So if I look at this form, I'm going to run it. I have a student. I add a student. Does it make sense to wouldn't it make sense to make major be a drop down? And then since we have standardized courses, wouldn't it make sense to have title be a drop down? So let's see how we do that. Well, first off, if we look at, we're going to be looking at studentwindow.xaml. You know, before we may have done a drop down, and we may have gone to properties for a drop down, and let's see where they put it. Not an automation. Is it miscellaneous? Oh, I haven't made a drop down yet. So I'm going to delete the text box. Duh. So I'm going to delete this text box, and I'm going to, from my toolbox, drag in a drop down. And they call it a combo box in Microsoft World. So I'll make this fit the space there. And so we've got this combo box, and I'll give it a name. And combo boxes have a content that tells what its contents are. So let's see. Do we have a smart tag in here? Oh, I just made an event. So it's got add combo box item. So normally you would say add combo box item, and then you would fill these up manually. You may have done that already for one of the assignments, but I don't want to do that. I want this to be done programmatically, and I want it to pull from the database. So I'm going to leave this with just the name, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to view code, and let me get rid of selection changed here event. I didn't want that event. And so I think I can get rid of this safely now. And where I'm going to fix this is in the constructor here, after initialize component, I'm going to set the drop downs here. And I'm going to need a school object to work with. And I'm going to say combo box course dot item source equals school dot courses. And oh, I don't have that yet, so I'll just comment that out. Combo box major dot item source is equal to school dot majors. I'll do that later. So does this seem kind of odd to everyone at this point? we'll get back to that. But it seems weird to me that within the student window, I have to instantiate a school. And I'm just going to create it and throw it away just to get access to majors. But that's okay. We'll address that later. But now my combo box item source is set to majors, and I have to fix this because I'm referencing text box major here, which no longer exists. So this is now combo box.major or combo box major.text. And I'll run that and see what happens. So now I add a student, and you can see that it's picking up the majors from school. So this works. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so this is nice to do this programmatically because now I've got this tied into the database. If the database gets updated, the form updates automatically. I'm going to do the same thing with the title for the classes. That should probably be a combo box as well. So again, I'm going to go to my toolbox and drag a combo box in here and give it a name. Combo box course title, I guess, would make sense. And again, I'm going to go into the code and I'm going to set its item source equal to my school dot courses. And it should have something broken down here. So now this is combo box course title. And so I'll run this real quick, see what it looks like. And now I've got drop-downs, and they're tied into the database. What's better from a UI perspective, text box or drop-down? I suppose it depends, you know, what your particular application is. But drop-downs are nice because they reduce the errors of people, you know, that people might make, and so often, you know, you probably in your UI you have one place where you type in the text for something, and everywhere else kind of uses drop-downs. It's not a bad approach. Sometimes you need to be able to give the person flexibility to type new things. There's also a lot of different types of there's some libraries out there that you can buy access to, but like by Telerik, which have some really cool combo box or drop-down functionality where you can either type in them or use the drop-down. So there's some neat things with UI, but that's the basic functionality of a drop-down, and these are tied to the database. So if I click submit on that, let's see what happens if I do I have the ability to add? Not yet. But one of the things you might have to do is when you make a form, you know, if you add the capability to edit the you know, the majors over the drop downs, you might have to refresh that list box. It probably is fine because it gets instantiated each time it pops up, but sometimes you have to if you have one box or you have one list that affects other things, you have to make sure you refresh all those dependent objects. And combo boxes, just like list boxes, will have you see there's a refresh method for combo boxes, just like list boxes. So if you ever have to refresh those, you can do that too. Okay, so any questions on that? So I'm going to then go on. Let me see. This one gets turned into... Yeah, that goes turned into this one, WPF data demo. So when you're complete with that one, you can turn that in there. And that's pretty much all that's left for that demonstration. So I'm going to move on to the next demonstration and talk about more CRUDing data in more detail. So did everyone get that to run? Does anyone need me to help get their program to work? What's it doing, Ali? What did we do last time? It's building but not showing up. So that could be, and this is something that's useful to know how to troubleshoot for everybody. Oh, the connection string. Run in debug mode and see if you have see if this was correct, because it might be that, and some mistakes that I often see with connection strings are sometimes there'll be a slash in here. That could be the problem. And if you have double quotes, yeah, and yeah, that the file may not be named properly, and so if you're like missing a little semicolon in there, that can be the problem. And then notice this data directory. Yeah, and then the school.cs is another area where you can get, that has to match this. If you run in debug mode, yeah, that might be right here. Or it might be...
Argument exception happens with something that your query's returning. It's receiving an argument it's not expecting somewhere.
Yeah, that one looks like that's within the C# code, not within the SQL.
Yeah, it's definitely a C# thing, but you can get it if your database is throwing an error when it's trying to return something, or you're returning something to a SQL command execute that doesn't want it.
Yeah, so run in debug mode and hover over connection string and see if you're getting your connection string. Most likely this is like, yeah, most likely what's happening is you're not getting this out of the, you're not getting this connection string out of the code. And so one way you can debug that is put your debug right over here and run in debug mode. And you're almost guaranteed to fight connection strings at some point in your life quite a bit. So if I hover over my connection string right now, it says null, and then I'm going to hit F10, change that. Okay, so I will do it with the button. So I step over. Now when I hover over the connection string, I can see I successfully got my connection string. Go away. I don't want to do that yet. Okay, so I successfully got my connection string, and I can kind of see it here that it came through. So if you don't have okay, yes. So if you put a carriage return, so if you put like a carriage return in here or something, it might get it kind of confused and messed up. So is that working for everybody? And it's okay, because that's useful for everyone to see where your things can go wrong with your connection strings. And they will go wrong. Okay.
Also, to point out, XML and JSON both use Pascal case rather than camel case.
Yeah.
That is something that can cause problems.
Yeah. Now, let's see. This is Pascal case, or this is camel case, and then if we go look at our school.cs, it's that one's Pascal cased in C#, and it's in the app config is camel case, which means it starts with a lowercase here. So just some of the seams between different formats.
Just some additional things to look at if you're having an issue.
Yep. And usually we end up spending some time chasing those things down. Luckily, for most applications, once you set the connection string, you're not changing it very often until you deploy. Okay, so I'm going to stop this and go on to the next demonstration. And so I'm going to go to Learning Modules. And we're going to learn CRUD, how to CRUD a application. So there's a few other, so we're going to look at data set classes and data table classes a little bit. And so there's a structure of these classes in .NET that allow us to store information from a database. And within that, a data set is actually, basically think of data set as a class representation of a database. And a data set consists of a collection of data tables. If you think about it, a database is a collection of data tables. It doesn't necessarily have a relationship to a database. It's kind of it's basically a convenient structure to hold the tables you're getting from the database. You can think of it as a database, I think, but technically it's really just, it's a collection set to hold a bunch of data tables. So the data table class is actually what, holds a lot of our data. And it's within the system.data namespace, which means that you may have to have that using directive up there. And you can make a data table by itself. So you can instantiate a data table as just a data table, or you can use it as a member of the data set, which a data set will have a collection of data table objects. And then there's this data view class, which is another .NET framework object that's used for data. And so the data set has a tables property, which is basically it's a list of data tables. Now, within the data table property, within a data table, what you have is a data table has a data column collection, a data row collection. And what those are is basically it's just something to define what each column, what type of data is in that column. The data row is actually where the data exists. And so row 1, row 2, row 3, etc. will have the actual data. And you can also add a foreign key constraints collection, a unique constraints. So you can actually make this table be a very strong representation of the table in memory. You don't have to use all of these constraints and everything, and those may or may not reflect what's in the data table, in the database table. Often if you get a data table from a database, these things will be set automatically. Or you can make a data table up, and with a data adapter, you can actually have it make the table for you in the database. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. We're going to use these principally just to hold the data information, so we won't be setting all the features of a data table or exploring them. But you can do a lot with these structures. And one of the reasons is because we're actually going to end up using Entity Framework later on, and that's what most people do. And Entity Framework actually uses these other features of data sets and data tables underneath, and we don't usually have to work with them directly. So think of a data table really as a collection of rows. And then it also has this thing that is the data column collection, which indicates what type of thing is in each row. So data set is a collection of data tables. Data table is a collection of rows. So we're going to be using this in conjunction with SQL Server. You can either populate them directly with your code, or there's a class called a data adapter, which can automate a lot of the process of getting data and inserting, updating, deleting data. So I think we're going to do it the more primitive way first, and then if we get a chance, we'll get into a data adapter as well. So the data column class that's in a data table has properties that define what's within a data table. And it can store information for a Boolean, decimal, integer, timespan, byte, double, pretty much anything that you would typically use, including string. And you can also specify whether a column is nullable or not. So basically, you have the same settings as you would in SQL for defining data. A single. I believe that is probably an 8-bit integer. So single is an 8-bit integer. And so here's an example of creating a column. We're not going to get into this so much, but here I'm creating a column called customer ID equals new data column, customer ID type of int. So we're saying that this column is going to be an int. Allow DB null false, read only false, auto increment true, auto increment seed. These are basically the same settings we did when we were working with the database directly. So you could use this to kind of build a database basically in code. And here I have a new column called name. It's just saying DB null false. and unique, true type of string. So you can set things very much like you would with a database. And so these are some of the column properties. I'm not going to get into it that much because we're not going to use it that much with what we have, but it's good to kind of just indicate for some things that there are these possibilities out there. The data row class is actually what stores our data. And here's an example of iterating through a data set. So here we have a data set which has some tables. We're going through the customers table, and we're going through all the rows in that table. And so we're going to throw data row as a type. So for each data row in those rows, we're then going to say for each data column in DS tables customers columns, right line, and notice, and then what we can do is we can say data column dot column name is going to go here, and then current equals, and we're going to say we're going to take our data column, we're going to take our row, get the, pass in a data column, comma, and then there's a data row version, current, default, and original. So if you modify a data table, it will actually keep track of what the original value was there, what the current value is there, and then if there's a default set for it, what the default value is. So every time you make a change, current goes into original, and then the new thing goes into current. The reason it needs to update that is because a data adapter will use that to figure out if it needs to send an update command to a database. And so the reason why, so for each data row, it will actually store current, default, original, and proposed, so that a data adapter later on can use that to update the database it might be associated with. So current is the value that's presently within that column. If no edit has occurred, that will be the same as original. Default is what the default is, if any has been set up for that column. Original is what was there before the last change. And proposed, when changes are in progress for a row, it is possible to retrieve this modified value. And so if there's a, I think that's for if you need a roll back because a transaction didn't go through, they have proposed. And then data rows also need information about their state. Added indicates that the row has been newly added to the table. Deleted means it's been deleted. Detached indicates a row is in the state immediately after it was created and can also be returned to the state by calling data row remove. A detached row is not considered to be part of a data table. So basically, if you add something and remove it before you update a database, it might be considered detached. And then modified indicates that it was there before, but you made a change to it. And then the row can be unchanged, indicates that the row has not been changed since the last called except changes. These are all kept track of for a data adapter so that a data adapter can go through. And the way a data adapter works is you make all your modifications to the, first you do a call, you do a select query to the database, pull everything into your data table. You can make as many modifications and changes to the data table you want. And then when you want to update the database, you can update it with the data adapter from your table, and it will automatically figure out what insert, update, or delete queries it needs to run. There's a bunch of stuff for schema generation, where we're going to let the C# do it for us, but you can actually manually create a schema in a data table in a data set. And so how do we populate a data set or data table with a data adapter? And so we're going to use a data adapter, and data adapters provide methods and properties that allow you to perform the following functions of a database: create, read, update, and delete. So if we're going to use a data adapter, we can say we want our select statement to be select contact company name from customers. Then we create a data adapter, and we pass in this select query and a connection. Then we create something. We create our data set. We instantiate our data set, and then we say data adapter, fill that data set from customers, and it will fill up the data adapter. And then We then have a data table in there called customers, and we can explore that data table and get all the information from the database from it. You can also use stored procedures. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but you can use a stored procedure instead of just passing a query. And here, basically, you just put in the name of the stored procedure rather than the query, and it will use that stored procedure if it's in the database. In all other respects, it's the same. Then let's say you wanted, once you made some changes to your data set, you want to persist it back in the database. So in addition to a select command, you can also create insert, update, and delete commands. And once you define each of these commands, you can use the data adapter update method, and the data adapter will figure out which ones to call. So let's see what we have as a demo for this. So there's a starter for this one. I'm going to download this this starter and extract it. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 40 after and continue on with this demo. So go ahead and open up that starter, and then we'll go through it. Okay, I'm back. Can everyone hear me? So this is pretty much what we just did or had up till now. So we have the constructor in school that has the get data method. So I'm going to run this, make sure that it's functioning. And yeah, we have looks like a functioning program. So what I want to do is I'm going to have to do this refresh periodically. So I'm going to actually take this and extract a method out of it and call it refresh. So I've got this database refresh method that refreshes the form with its data. Control dot, by the way, will give you the option to refactor, so you can highlight things you want to move into another function, and then refactor and move it to a new function. It's a great way of simplifying or abstracting out things in your code. So now I want to add insert capability. So is everyone with me? Okay, so I'm going to go to schoolwindow.xaml. And I want this, okay, this button will be useful. I'm going to move it over here. And then I'm going to get rid of this label. I don't really need it. And I'm going to bring in a text box. And I'm going to give the text box a name. TXP Campus. And the button, I'm going to call it BTN Campus add update. And set its content to be add. And then I'm going to once you have those two, just make sure you name them and then, make the button say add. I'm going to add an event handler. So this looks like something that was there before. I'm going to get rid of this. I don't like the name of that function. You could repurpose that existing method, but I wanted it to have a better name. So now I've got this add update click, but button event. What I want to do is add items to the database. So whenever you have a form, the temptation is going to be to just take the stuff from the text box and add it to the list box, or add it to the underlying list box. When we're dealing with databases, often what we want to do is we want to put something into the database and then refresh our list from the database. And this example is not exactly perfect in the approaches to do that, but it'll do for now. So I'm going to first add item to the database, and then what I'm going to do is refresh school and list box. So now what I'm going to do is say string in str, insert string is equal to insert into campus and name. And I'm going to look at my database just to make sure that I'm using the right values. So if you double click on your database, yeah, it is campus and it is name. So okay, feel comfortable with that. And values. At name. Then I'm going to make my connection string. And again, I'm going to get this from the configuration manager. Doesn't recognize configuration manager, so I'm going to hit Control dot so that I can add the using system configuration. And then I'm going to go to my connection strings. I'm going to grab school DB and then connection string. So that gets me my connection string. And then using an SQL connection, CONN is equal to, let's see what app config is. SchoolDB. Thanks. Make a new connection, passing in that connection string to make that connection. We're putting that in why do we put this in a using directive?
So that it'll automatically close it when we're done with it.
Yeah, and also if there's a exception that happens, it'll automatically close our connection. And then we're going to make a SQL command. I'm going to call it insert command equals new SQL command. And we're going to put in the insert str and then our connection. So this is probably similar to what we did before. If we look at school, we made a SQL command here. In this case, it was a select. Right now, we're going to make, and then remember, we use a data reader to get everything out of the select. This one, we're making a SQL command again, just like we did before. And let's see, are we missing a using directive? No, we shouldn't.
parentheses under this QL.
And then up here, Chris, if you have that, you make sure that you have the using directive, using system data SQL client. And then we're going to use insert parameters.add with value. And we're going to say name and text box campus dot text. So, why do we have this parameters thing, and why do we add with value? And why do we use this @ symbol in here?
To sanitize.
To sanitize our inputs. And this is something you want to pay close attention to because it's a security thing. And it's really one of those security things that really only we as programmers are going to fix. Your network administrator, your system administrator will not be able to do anything to protect against this. They might be able to identify this problem, but as programmers, we really need to be the ones that are on top of this particular security vulnerability. And what it is that sometimes, rather than doing stuff like this, what someone might be tempted to do is do something like this. They might be tempted to just concatenate in what's in this text box into this query. What could be the vulnerability in that? It's not such a big thing with a standalone application, but if this was a kiosk application where the general public is walking up and typing things in, or even if it was like a network application that multiple people in the organization are running, then this can become a serious vulnerability. What's wrong with just concatenating the string in that way and building my my insert command that way? Anyone but Carrie.
Okay. I shut up. I'll bring up something else, but I'll shut up.
Anybody have an idea? Yeah, Tommy, you're correct. It is a SQL injection problem. And why? How does this insert a vulnerability? Yeah, because someone can insert their own code into that. They could write their own SQL query, essentially. And let me see if I can find it. You may have, this is usually shown way too much, but I'm going to go ahead and show it anyway because it is a really good example. It's the XKCD comic called Exploits of a Mom. Hi, this is your son's school, having some computer trouble. Oh dear, did he break something? In a way, did you really name your son Robert? Close quote, close parentheses, semicolon, drop table, students, semicolon, dash, dash. Oh yes, little Bobby Tables we call him. Well, we've lost this year's student records. I hope you're happy. And I hope you've learned to sanitize your database inputs. The way you read this is, what she's doing here is she's finishing out the previous query. She's putting a semicolon to stop the SQL command. Then she's injecting her own command, which is drop table students, putting a semicolon to finish that command, and then the dash dash is the comment. So then everything else gets commented out. So if we were to look at this code in theory, if you inserted something like values blah, and then I close out the parentheses, and then put a semicolon, and then I say drop table campus, and semicolon dash dash, you would see that this dash dash would comment out this last one. This would actually, and I think I probably would have to do this. This would finish this out, this command, and then I'd have my command inject inside. That's the injection part of SQL injection. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
So you can see network security person is not going to fix this when writing code, and this thing shows up on their application. And the danger is that it's going to run, that these commands will run at whatever level the database has been authorized for this application, which is often higher than what the typical user has. So, Carrie, did you notice anything else with that?
There's also the thought that validation. So it matters more depending on if you're entering something that is like a tiny int, which is like a Boolean, or you're entering something that's like a drop-down option or something. You don't want to send your data that you don't know is decent data. So what I'm saying is,
yeah,
you
typically
want to validate for it being decent data before you put it in your table. So that's just a bad idea.
Yeah, and often you might put some validation guards up at the top of a function where you're updating databases, and it would do some validation before you got in here. So we don't want to do it that way. What we want to do is instead, leave the bad example there. Instead, what we do is we use a SQL parameter, and we precede that with an @ And so this is kind of a promise. Hey, I will give you a name here to put in here, but for now, that's what the command is. We create our command with that command, and then for this insert command that we're using that string with, we will use the parameters.add with value. And then what you do is you put the name, that's this name here, goes here, and then you put what you want to go in there. And this parameters add with value will actually sanitize this and make sure that this is not code, and will make sure it'll actually turn it into a string. And so if they did put some SQL injection code there, it would just show up as the actual name as SQL injection text, but not executable. And this will sanitize the inputs and take care of that. Does that make sense? I like to go over that carefully, because that's one of the first things, that when you go and become software devs, I would consider it a favor if you wouldn't get me a reputation of teaching people who leave SQL injection holes in their code. So that's how and that's called a parameterized query. And a parameterized query is basically one that has an @ parameter, and then you put in the values for that parameter later. The nice thing about this too is this looks a lot cleaner than using the concatenation and everything. I actually think it's easier to read. So we've got our parameterized query, we've got our insert command. Then what we need to do is make sure our connection is open before we execute our command, because you can't execute a command on a closed connection. And then we're going to take our insert command, and we're going to execute And if you look at this, there's a lot of executes. What was the execute that we used before? So let's look at school.cs.
So scholars are in when you expect exactly one response back, one field back.
But notice last time we used execute reader. And we use execute reader because we want a data reader because the select command in SQL is going to return something. Is our insert command to our database going to actually cause anything to come back?
Nope.
Nope. So in that case, we can use execute non-query. It's not a very good name, but basically what it means is it's going to execute without returning anything. That's what that means. And that means that then we don't need the rest of this stuff that we had in school.cs where we had a reader, we had to read through the reader. We're just telling the database, hey, insert this thing into the database. So we just say execute that command and that's it. So this is a good example of just using a simple SQL command. And there's a lot of different SQL commands. You can look them up on W3 Schools if you don't remember everything that you learned in SQL. But you can insert, update, delete, whatever your command is, you can write them like this. This, by the way, is not using a data adapter or data sets or tables yet. This is just using a query. So if you're just using queries, you can read things with a data reader like this, or you can execute commands like this. Those two basically are the two formats for not using data adapters or tables when you're working with a database. And you can do pretty much anything you want with just those two command structures with a database. That's the fundamental way of connecting to a database. Does that make sense? So it remains to see if my code works. It's always the scary part. It's a lot easier to just talk about it and then just forget about running it. So I've got this text box. I'm going to add Mars. CNN Mars is going to be opening up, I think, sometime in the future. And it didn't update. What am I missing? No refresh. So let's add a refresh. So that was probably list box major. Oh, that's this campus. Was I even on the wrong one? Right one? Yeah. Listbox campus dot items dot refresh. Let's see if that works. Campuses. Okay. All right, let's see. Let's put a stop point, see if it's working. Ah, okay, I think I know what's going on. So I am in fact going through and doing everything. I get my connection string, I create my SQL connection, I pass this in, I execute my command, it executes non-query. What am I not doing? Let me give you a hint. So I got it in the database, but do I have it in school?
Oh.
So what do I need to do in order to make sure that it gets refreshed? I kind of need to refresh these things from school. So I'm going to call refresh here. Now this is kind of wasteful because I'm doing 2 extra select queries. Probably these three should be separated out, but we'll do that. So I need to call the school.refresh method. And that means that I need, I'm going to need this to be public. Which means that then I need school to be public. Is that the problem? So I need to call the schools refresh method, and then I should be able to get that to refresh. No? Why not?
Check your data. Make sure it updated properly. Did we update the right table?
Yeah, it might also be that database. That may not be the one that actually gets updated. So
Yeah, it didn't get updated.
Well, not necessarily. You have to look at the one in bin. This is one thing to note. You have the one in your database, in your project, it gets copied over into bin, and you notice that there's another database that's called school.mdf. And then if I look at that one, let's see if it updated in here. I got 2 CNN Marses in there, so it's clearly it's updating. So that's not the problem. It's somewhere in the refresh, I think. And it might just be that the problem is that this is... yeah, good point. Do we actually... Yeah, we have that. And then we refresh campuses. So we've got that. So I'm wondering if maybe the problem is, first I want to make sure that it's not a question of the window not being large enough.
Well, it's a list box. Shouldn't it get an arrow?
It should. Yeah, it's not updating. So run in debug mode. Got a good connection string. Insert into campus name. Values at name. Got my SQL connection. Got my SQL command. Open. Insert command. And let's see if that executed okay.
I don't remember, but I think even execute or non-query can come back with a Boolean or something of that nature. Maybe I'm thinking something else. I'd like to know if it was successful, but...
Well, let's see. So that looks like that worked. We're going to go into, step into that one. Look, that added it. So this item, so it actually pulled it out of the database. So it's definitely in the database. And then I'll step over, come back. Campus. Added value. So let's see. Step over. I look at campus. Campus looks good. And then I'm going to go back to here. Put my stop point there and continue up. And if I look at my school, campus has ASDF in it. And then list box campuses has 7 items. I should be refreshing that. And if I look at items, still has 7 items. So for some reason this refresh didn't refresh the items. The only thing, now the problem might be, and this might actually be kind of useful. Let me ask a question. Okay, this is good. I think I know what's going on. What's the items? So the item source was pointed at some list called school.campus. So now we have a thing pointing to whatever school.campus is. Now we go through and we're in here. Oh, I'm running over time. I'll finish this up real quick because this is a really good concept. What am I doing with get data right there?
Creating a new string, a list of strings.
I'm creating a new object, aren't I? What could be the problem with that?
It's looking at the old object.
It's looking at the old object. So right here, we pointed to the old object. Because item source is pointing to the old object, it does not lose a reference to that object. That stays in memory even when down here I create a new one and point at that new one. So now items, I return items from this, and I set campus and school to point to this new one, but my school window is actually looking at the old one. and it still has a reference for it. So when I refresh, I'm not refreshing off the new one, I'm refreshing off the old one. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So we're going to leave it at there, and I want you all to think about how do we fix that? And try to think through and see what the problem is. And yes. And so I'm glad this kind of happened, because these are the kinds of things you will see with object-oriented programming, and it's useful to know how to kind of navigate through them. So that's all I have for today. Next time we will continue on, and we'll go set up a data table, and data adapter is another way. And then we'll talk about how do we fix that problem. I think probably we could like reset the item source in here, and that would fix it, but it'd be kind of hacky, and it would leave what I'd call like a mess for somebody else to discover by accident. Carrie can tell us that almost never happens in code bases, that everyone always keeps everything nice and clean. But you probably want to try to find ways of fixing these things so that they stay nice and neat. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
And then I'll stay online if anyone needs any help with anything. Yeah, go ahead, Ali. Oh, Enigma is a program that is usually done in C++ to or Java, but basically it's kind of this. The Enigma machine back in World War II was basically an encoding machine, a coding machine, and so we have this program that's that replicates Enigma. Where you put in a phrase and you can pick one of three different encryption algorithms, and then it'll encrypt it in one of those algorithms. And the way it's implemented in the projects we have is we make you make a Enigma base class, and then you make a and then what you do is you make 3 inherited classes. Each one has a different way of implementing Enigma. And, you can imagine, it depends on the spec, but typically you have some, you have a standard, in it you have like some kind of command that gets called that has to be implemented by each one that has a different, that you code a different algorithm to it. But basically, it's a good way of, it's a good example of polymorphism. Do you have that assignment in another class right now? Yeah. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to I don't know if that one's an abstract class or if it's a fully abstract class or if it's a just a base class and then you inherit from it. But you're going to be implementing that base class, and you're probably going to make the encode and decode functions be abstract, and then in the classes that inherit from that, you're going to implement the code for encrypting and decrypting it. And all that entails is basically you look at the algorithm and you write code to implement that algorithm. So, the way you attack this is just do your base Enigma class and just do one inherited class and just get that one to work. Once you get that, and pick the simplest one, because there's 3 probably different algorithms. One is simpler than the other, so you pick the simplest one and get that one to work first. Once you get that one to work, then all you have to do is implement 2 additional classes, and then if it's a GUI program, you probably have a drop down once you pick the algorithm, and then you just make sure you instantiate the right Enigma object. Or actually, I think she will probably, yeah. So like one way you could do, I don't know which algorithm she's having you implement, but a simple transposition code would be add 5 to whatever the ASCII value is, and then if it goes over the end of the ASCII value, then roll it back around. So if you go to let me pull up ASCIItable.com. So ASCIItable.com basically gives you the ASCII table. And what you could say is like, okay, capital A, where's that? Capital A is at 65. So capital A is at 65 and Z is at 90. So if you added 5, so if you add X and you added 5, then X plus the value for X is, oh, I lost my mouse. Wow, lost power. Hold on a second. So if I look at, if I have V and I added 5, that'd be 91. 91 would be greater than Z. So then I would start back over at A with 65. So, V would translate to A if it was just a +5. I think it's more complicated than that, which you have your algorithm. But, you got to read through those algorithms and implement them. I would start off by implementing the simplest one and just making the code work with that one. And then what I would do is then implement the more difficult ones. Does that make sense? And for example, if the encode is to add 5, then the decode would be to subtract 5. If I remember that program, there's a lot of really crazy algorithms in there. Are you doing it in Java now? Yep. Yeah, and then you might have done the C++ one and C++1, so it'll definitely be different. You'll be using object-oriented programming to do it. Yeah, there you would just be doing it as a structured programming. You just have different functions. Probably as function overloads is what you would have done there, which is interesting because you could think of it as essentially in some ways um, um, over overridden functions are a little bit like overloaded functions. Night, everyone. See you Wednesday.